answer correct or not. So when we take a look at this, we have done the 1 step already, 2 step, and then we're working on the 3 step. But I'm showing you all 3 together so that you see a progression and see that it's just 1 step building on to the next. And you're just looking back and doing basic math operations: addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. Now the hang up I find with most students is that they panic when they see fractions, or they panic when they see negatives and positive integers. So we'll try and work through these, and hopefully you'll get a better sense of how to solve these. Now, 1 step, remember, is I'm using x as your variable, and the other letters are to represent those constant numbers. So ax equals b, x over a equals b, or a over x equals b. Those are the only 3 types of equations that you are going to see doing the 1 step. So I put an example of all 3 on the board that we're going to work through together. Now if you take a look at this, 3x equals 0.6. Now this tells you to do what? Obviously to multiply. So the opposite of multiplying is dividing. So you have to take 3x, and you're taking the number, always the number that's with the variable. So we're going to divide by 3, and again, back to what you do on one side, you have to do on the other side. You are going to have to divide this side by 3. So now, this is what I call zeroing out. You've zeroed out the 3, so you're left with the x, and use your calculators. 0.6 divided by 3 will give you 0.2. Now, that is your answer. X is equal to 0.2. But if we want to take this, and probably a good idea is to check and make sure that it is correct. If we're saying x is 0.2, we can put this back into the original equation again. So that really means we're going to do 3, and I'll put brackets representing the multiplying. 0.2 equals 0.6. Now if you take that, run it through your calculator, you will see that you're correct. Alright, move to the next one. This is the one, don't panic. You see fractions. X over 4 equals 2. So you are going to take and realize, now that you're in high school, that this x over 4 really means to divide. Well, the opposite of division is multiplication. So we are going to take this and we are going to multiply it. Again, whatever the number is with the variable, that's what you use. And what you do to one side, we're going to do to the other side. So you are going to multiply both sides. Now, this 4 is going to zero out that 4. So you're left with x equaling 2 times 4 is 8. So here you have x equals 8. Now are we right or are we not? We're going to have to check this out. So again, if we do a check, you're going to take what you have for x and put it back into your original equation again. So we have 8 over 4 equals 2. And again, if you want to use your calculator, 8 divided by 4 equals 2. So you know that you're correct. Alright, moving on to the next 1 step. Again, now you see that the variable, I've changed the variable here to an h instead of an x. It represents the same thing. So don't let, when you see different letters being used as variables, throw you off. It still stands as a variable. Now, 24 over h equals negative 4. So what do we have to do with this? You have to remember that that is division, 24 divided by h. But now the third do step is a over x equals b. So I'm using this as an example. And the first step is to isolate the variable. Now there's different ways of doing this. We can write it as an improper fraction, so you know that negative 4 or any number over 1 is still that number. So we've got negative 4 over 1. Now I'm going to work this through, because if you have this, we are going to take the h and try and eliminate or put the variable onto one side of the question. So we're going to take your 24 divided by your -4, and there's a couple ways of doing this. So we will do this together so that you are aware how we are going to do this. And -4 over h over -4. So what we've done here is cross multiply. So we have taken and multiplied this and multiplied this. So that's where you're left with your 24 and your -4h. Now we have to eliminate, again, zeroing out. You've got your -4, divide by your -4, 24 divided by -4. So again, use your calculator. 24 divided by -4 is -6h. So that's one way of solving that equation, and I'm going to show you the other way of solving it. You can take your h, we'll use green, times your 24 over h, because again, we're using this equation, -4. Alrighty, and you are going to multiply what we do to one side, we are going to do to the other. So you're going to multiply that side by h. So this zeroes that out, correct? And you're going to take your 24 equals -4h. And again, now you're back to the same step. You want your variable isolated, you wanted it by itself, so you are going to divide by the number that's with that variable, divide by that number, and this zeroes out. And again, you're left with h equaling 24 divided by -4 is your -6. Now if we wanted to check this and make sure we're correct, either way is a process, and there's many ways of solving the question. Even when you're working with fractions, often you can change them into decimals if you're more comfortable with decimals than using the fractions. But we're going to put this back into the original question. So we now have 24, and we're saying h is now -6 in both respects. So -6 equals -4. And in your calculator, 24 divided by -6. All right, now we're moving on to two-step. Now, don't get overwhelmed. One step was only one math operation. You were either multiplying or dividing. Now we're going into the two-step operation, so now you are either adding or subtracting and multiplying or dividing. So that's where the two operations come in. Now, I've got ax plus b equals c. That's your one form of two-step linear equations. Or, again, fraction, x over a plus b equals c, where x is your variable on both of these samples. But again, can be replaced by any letter of the alphabet to represent a variable. Now, take a look at this equation. 2x plus 1 equals 7. Right off the hop, you have to isolate the variable. But before we can isolate the variable, we have this plus 1 in the picture. Now, to take this plus 1 and think back to your algae tiles, to zero out an algebra tile, you have to take the opposite. So the opposite of plus 1 is -1. And again, think back to the scales. What you do to one side of the scales, you do to the other. So if we subtract 1 on that side, we have to subtract 1 on this side. So now you're left with 6, but this is now zeroing out. So you now have 2x equals 6. So that is the first step to this two-step linear equation. Now we're back to that one-step process again. This tells you to multiply, so the opposite of multiplying is dividing. So you take the number that is with that variable, which is 2, divide by 2, all right, divide so by 2. You have zeroed out plus 1, minus 1, and 7, take away 1. What we do to one side, we do to the other. It leaves us with 2x equaling 6. But now we're back to that one-step process. So you have to go back to your one-step linear equation when you were either multiplying or dividing. And this tells you to do multiplication. So the opposite is division. Divide with that number that is with the variable. And what you do to one side, you do to the other. So now you zeroing out this 2, you're left with x equaling 6 divided by 2 is 3. So your answer for solving for x equals 3. Now to check and see if that is the correct answer, we go back to the original equation and plug in your answer. So now you have 2x, which is no longer an x, pardon me. You are now multiplying that by 3 because you said x equals 3 plus 1 equals 7. And now you go back to your bed mass and you're remembering what the order of operations are. 2 times 3 is 6. 6 plus 1 equals 7. And definitely 7 equals 7. So that you know that your answer is correct. Now we're going over to this equation. The x over a plus b equals c. Now again, looks overwhelming. Decimals are involved. Fractions are involved. But don't let it sort of overwhelm you. Go back 2 steps. The first thing we have to do is get rid of this negative 2.5. Now, the opposite of negative 2.5 is to add a 2.5. And what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. Now, I want to remind you of that number line. For people that are sort of still not quite sure which way on the number line that you're going, and you're not using your calculator, remember we are starting way down here at 3.7. So 3.7 is down on your negative end, and you are adding a positive 2.5. So you are coming back to this end of the ballpark. So that ends up to be 3.7 plus 2.5 ends up to give you negative 1.2. So you are back down here where it is negative 1.2 because this process here was adding your positive 2.45. Now if we were adding negative, you're going further down to the left. So back to this equation, we now have this zeroing this out, and you are left with x over 2.8 equaling negative 1.2. Now we're into that 2-step process. So the opposite of this division question now will be multiplication. We're going to take this, and the opposite of division is multiplying, and you take the number that is with the variable, so you have to multiply this 2.8 to zero this out, but then you are also multiplying this by 2.8. And again, zeros this out, x equals, and negative 1.2 times 2.8, if you put it into your calculator, you should end up with negative 3.36. Now, that is your answer, but to put it back into the equation again, you have to check and see if it is correct. So let's do a check over here and make sure that our answer is correct. So we are now back to the original equation. You're going to put your negative 3.36 over 2.8, subtract your 2.5, and that equals negative 3.7. So now, again, remembering what you're going to do first, negative 3.36 means really to divide by 2.8. So you're left with negative 1.2, subtract 2.5 equals negative 3.7, and negative 1.2, and again, you're going back down towards the negative end, becomes negative 3.7 equals negative 3.7. So you know that your answer
All right, now
is
we're on
correct.
to the 3-step, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll